So the lab manual has 6 labs. First one really is just to give you an idea of what we're going to do here. The little disclaimer up here, just something we always have to put up in case we tell you anything that might or might not happen in the future. So do feel free to ask us questions. There is a future session. Has that happened now? It has happened, okay. Oh, so there is another one this afternoon. Good.
Okay.
So if you want to know the future of SRM, there is a specific session for that, and so they can go into a lot more detail there. But if we do say anything here, you know, we're not marketing, we're not official, so don't take our word as rote. So the idea of this lab is really to give you an idea of how to troubleshoot SRM, some of the problems you might find, take you through the graphical interface, how to insert scripts, how to call out other things in the live environment, because although VMware would like us to have the whole thing virtualized, unfortunately, we understand that the world is not entirely virtual yet, so we need to speak to the outside world. And really take you through some of the things about how do we deal with, you know, 2 sites, 2 different sets of IP addresses, different networks, how do you migrate things between them. So hopefully we'll get through that and give you some better idea. And then you can go downstairs to the ones that haven't tried it and have a go yourself. So we just a little bit of positioning of where this fits. It's a kind of an intermediate level, so we expect some knowledge of SRM, so we're going to assume some. If you leave the room completely confused, either come and stop us and ask us some questions afterwards, or go downstairs and do the install and configure. So for an agenda, first we're just going to show you around the lab environment, what we've got, what the architecture looks like, where the virtual machines are, what we've got to play with. Secondly, we'll look at troubleshooting a failed installation. So this is a manufactured failure, so we've created the problem. It's not a specific problem that you'll see in the real world, but it will give you an idea of where to look when you get a problem like that, and hopefully give you a heads up on how to use the log files. Inserting scripts, changing test networks, and we'll go through these in more detail. And finally, large-scale IP customization. And at the end, a little bit about how we can use scripts that actually with some extra logic in them, so what we call conditional scripts, which can look for conditions in the environment and then make decisions based on that. So the lab environment is what we've got up here. We're using Falcon Store NSS virtual appliances, so they're iSCSI appliances. They're replicating between 2 virtual sites. So it's a complete iSCSI setup. We've got 2 ESX servers on each site. One site has some nested VMs, so these are VMs running on those ESX servers. They're the ones we're going to allow to play around with, change the IP addresses, decide what networks they connect to. And finally, you'll notice, and any of you who've done any of the labs here so far will know about the control center VM. So the control center VM really is, it's kind of like the administrator's workstation. So it's your access into the environment. Everything you do will be executed from that. So that completes lab 1. Easy, huh? So we're using SRM4. So we're not using the SRM4 It required. It was when we were building the lab. It was just pre-launch of that. So we thought we'd base it on code that was GA at the time. And really, there were a few things that were launched then. Really, majority of it was support for vSphere. So those of you that have played around with SRM1 will know that we didn't support vSphere, so now we're just supporting things like fault tolerance, distributed switches, and stuff like that. And we also doubled the scalability. So previously there was a limitation of 500 virtual machines per SRM server. We've now got 1,000. Any more detail, visit the website. These slides will be available, by the way, so there's a lot of information that I may not go through today. So in a couple of weeks, I think they're going to put these up on the website, and you'll be able to download it. So first lab, if I just switch on our ultra-modern switching machine over to the lab environment. Hopefully. Yep. So here we've got the environment like you'll see downstairs. On the left-hand side, we scroll over and we can have a look at, from a standard vSphere point of view. You can see your 2 sites, ESX at both sides, vCenter at both sides, the primary and recovery centers. We've then got a selection of virtual machines running on the primary side, and then the stub or placeholder virtual machines running on the DR side. So that's basically the architecture. And those of you that have been through the install and configure will have realized that's pretty much what you ended up with at the end of the lab. So for the first lab, we're going to run through, go to SRM, take a look at the recovery plan we created, and just have it test it. So what we'll notice here is that if we go to the recovery steps, we'll notice that it fails almost immediately. And what the lab manual shows you how to do is go through, discover what time the actual failure happened, then guide you through to the file structure of the SRM server to where the log files are held, take the exact time down to the second. We can then scroll down the log file, find the exact time when that happened, and we should see something like this. And at the appropriate time, you should see that there was a timeout. So what you'll see happening here is that the script was run, and there was an error taking the snapshot, and there was a timeout waiting for the SAN to respond. So we can then take that. We then, by using that, we know that the timeouts for the SAN provider are set wrong. And what we've actually done in the lab is actually manufacture them to be very, very low. So you see the plan errored incredibly quickly. And that's because if we look at the Site Recovery Advanced section, go into the Advanced section, settings, we look at the SAN provider setting, and we've got the SAN provider command timeout.
You're not showing it.
The default, sorry.
Do you want to show that?
Oh, good plan. You can't see. Good call, Paul.
All right. And just before you get there, if I may.
Yeah, sure. Carry on.
When you talk about the architecture that we have, the VMs, the virtual center infrastructure, the SRM installations. So for our lab today, the way it's set up is SRM and vCenter are co-located, are in the same box. So in the virtual storage appliances we have, SCSI communication, between SRM and the storage, we have this particular SRA, storage replication adapter. And what that allows us to do is really have the middleware, the communication between SRM and the native arrays. So this adapter allows us to talk natively to the arrays, XML back to SRM. So each of those SRAs is particular to the storage environment you have. So they're manufactured by the storage vendor, supported by the storage vendor and ourselves. But that's where what comes into play is that SRA, the middleware communication. And sometimes we make sure we have the right version, we have the right download from our website, making sure that that particular SRA also has the right, in the release notes, the right firmware we're talking to on the storage side.
Yeah, and that's probably something very important, is just to get all the release versions correct due to our support matrix, because that's absolutely going to cause you problems if you get that wrong. So what I've done here is change the timeout setting to 300, which is actually the default. So the reason we have this setting, you might say, well, why have you just manufactured it low? That's never going to happen in the real world. Why on earth is that any use to us? Well, the reality is every different storage vendor's SRA is different. They communicate with the storage in a different way. Some of them take a lot longer to do the snapshot, to do the test failover. And as a result, you may find you need to increase that depending on which storage vendor. The best option really is to ask your local VMware rep or a rep from the storage vendor themselves. And they'll probably have the best settings for that particular array.
And it might be environmental choice as well. Based upon your environment, you may need to change that value as well.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is commit those changes.
Question?
Yes, I was just going to point out that we've noticed the rescan option is often helpful to set that to 2 as well under that same screen you were just on.
Right. And again, based upon the default, changing that based upon your environment, right? Great.
Yeah, that's the speed that you rescan the HBAs at the DR site when you're picking up the new LUNs? Right.
Some storage arrays might be better off scanning twice, so that's why those options are good.
Cool. Okay, so we've now changed that. You will find, as you go through the lab, and you will find in the real world, when you make changes in the advanced settings, they do take a while to commit in the background. So if you run the test straight away again, it will probably fail. Don't be afraid by that. You may have fixed the problem. Run it a few minutes later, and it'll be fine. So in the essence, because we're relatively time limited in this session, we're not going to run the plan every time. We'll run it once at the end to show you all the changes we've made. So when we get to that point, it takes us through sort of lab 1. It gives you an idea of where you might look for those, or the directories that you might look for the log files, the logs for the SRA, the logs for the storage vendor, the logs for SRM itself, and shows you how you can use, in the recovery plan, the history tab, which I didn't show you, to look for the actual error itself. So one of the best uses, or the best things that SRM can do for you, is actually create this nice audit trail. So everything that ever happens in your DR process is actually audited. If we scroll down this, we're going to see exactly where the error is. and we're going to see exactly what time the plan run. So if we go into the, and I'm afraid off the side of the screen, you'd see the time it took to run as well. So we can then take that into the logs and find out exactly, a very good way to start troubleshooting. So at that point, do we have any more questions on this particular subject? No? Good? Obviously very clear. I'll move on. So for the third lab, no. So we've got a whole lot of detail in this presentation which you can go into in your own time. For the third lab, we're going to talk about working with scripts. So this is often, in the last couple of sessions we've done like this is probably the most questions we've had from people, because there's an awful lot of reasons why you might want to call something in the outside world. As I said before, VMware believes the whole world should be virtual, and you shouldn't pretty much never need to talk to anything outside it, but the reality is that's just not the case. So what if we're failing over a virtual machine, which is an application server which requires access to a Unix database? Well, we probably want to make sure that that database has actually been started. We might need to execute something on it. We might need to send something off to a switch, a firewall, make some change somewhere. It might be a load balancer for the application. It might be a DNS update. In this particular environment, we are going to run an incredibly simple script. Don't take this as the script is irrelevant. We're going to look at some environment variables, and we're going to write them to a text file, and that's it. So we're going to write the time, the date, and whether the plan was a recovery or a test. To do that, we'll switch back to my environment. We actually drill into the recovery plan, recovery steps, and at any stage here, we can just right-click and add a command step. And at this point, we will indicate where the script is located that we want to run. So in this case, we've just set up a scripts directory. Oops. And the main reason you'll see as you run through these labs that these don't work is by typing in the wrong thing. And so I'm almost certain I'll probably do that while we're going
System 32 without an S.
Sorry? Thank you. There you see, already a typo. You'll find as you're running through these, and to be honest, the more familiar you get, the four of us have spent so much time going through this lab in the last month or so that you almost go on autopilot. The more used to this you get. Yes, sorry, we've got a question at the back. Yep. Yeah, so you can run pretty much anything. What we're running here is anything located on the SRM server. So that's where it executes. So that's the only limitation, really. What people do, and in fact, in an early version of this lab, we actually wrote a script to call a script. There is also the VIX API. So by running scripts with that, we can actually run them inside the virtual machine. So if you need the script to execute in a different place, it's not a problem, there's a way around it. But in this interface, what we're executing is executing from the SRM server. So as long as you work from that basis, you can pretty much achieve anything by a sort of serial line of scripts if necessary. Yeah, so the next section of this lab really just explains...
Sorry, we just had a question here.
Oh,
I'm sorry, he's actually answering.
Okay. So the next section of this lab really takes us through... It'll ask you to run the plan. The plan will run through. We then go and check whether the log file's been written to. We can see whether we executed a test or a real failover. And we should find that in the right place. Again, I'm not going to run it now because it takes a few minutes, and you guys don't want to watch Blue Bar. You can go downstairs to watch that on your own. So that moves us over. We've got any questions on scripting while we're there? Any more? Any more for any more?
Hold on.
Yep. So if you're running, so at the end of the lab we show about the conditional script, and that will actually wait for a return code. So in that case, yes, we can wait for it. At this point, we are just firing the script off. Yeah.
What I was going to mention is the site recovery manager runs external scripts. We can pass the environment variable to the script to identify what recovery plan we're running, are we running in
And that's there if you need it, right? It's extensible to run commands, extensible to run, interface with other pieces of the infrastructure that may not be part of the SRM recovery.
So that kind of concludes lab 3. So lab 4 is really looking at the concept. Oh, supposed to be looking at the concept, but you're not again. So lab 4 introduces the concept of what network we connect to during a test. So by default, SRM will create a little bubble network on the server that the virtual machine arrives on during a test. Now that's pretty cool because it means we can take a virtual machine, we can keep it in the same Active Directory. It's not going to communicate with anything else. We can keep its IP addresses the same. That might be all very useful, but it's also not very useful if you need that application to communicate with something on the test site, because that's limited to a single ESX server. So that virtual machine can't talk to anything else. You couldn't really get any users to, test it. No UAT. You can't get it to communicate with anything on the outside world. It can't even communicate with another VM that's come up on another ESX server. So what this lab shows you is really the ability to create a test VLAN or a private test network that can have access to the outside world. It can also be mapped to multiple ESX servers. So when you're bringing up a bunch of VMs that make up a bunch of applications, you can bring them up on the test site, connect them to all different networks or all the same network. You can then even have a cafeteria environment with a whole lot of laptops so you can get users to come and log in, check emails actually working, check the data's actually there, check everything's real. You can also then communicate with things like the Unix database we talked about, so something that's not virtualized. So we can map that VLAN into the physical world. So all sorts of ways we can make the real test work. We were given quite a good example by a colleague of ours the other day that one of the tests they did before they were using SRM, when they failed things over and there was no network management, actually passed, and then it failed when they were using SRM. And the reason for that was because it was actually communicating back over the WAN and talking to the server that needed to. So they found an application dependency which they didn't even know about. So by using SRM and isolating the network, they were able to see that application dependency and then troubleshoot that, find out why, and migrate that application and put it as part of the recovery plan. So incredibly useful. To set up, it's very simple. We'll go back to the recovery plan.
Switch.
Oh, yeah, switch.
That's my job, switch. And the big thing here, about the virtual switches. Typically in environments, we would have a per-purpose, VLAN environment that I want to isolate from the infrastructure of production. But at that time, when I would do my test, it may be I need to talk to a mainframe. I need to talk to other non-virtualized infrastructure that I can now do a per-purpose configuration and have maybe a dual port on the secondary port on the mainframe or other infrastructure, the same VLAN as my test infrastructure, and can do validation against it.
So as you can see here, we just go back to the wizard, edit the recovery plan, go through, pick a predefined network. So we have to go and set this up. Just because we called it test network, it doesn't automatically exist. So this would be a VLAN or a test network that you mapped into the environment in vSphere, and then it'll appear available here. So in the lab, we do a very simplistic one and just connect this particular virtual machine to the virtual machines, in this case, to a network called test. And then we'll finish that. So that will now, next time we run, those machines will all come up in a different network. So the second, the next lab, if we move back onto the other screen, is all about bulk IP customization. Actually, just before we start that, has anybody got any questions on the previous one about test networks? Anybody been through this process in the real world? Good, a couple of you. I'm glad to hear that, because SRM is one of our best-selling products other than vSphere. In fact, I think the best-selling product other than vSphere currently on our part list. So we'll kind of hope that some of you are actually using it. So anyway, we'll move on to the next lab. The next lab is about IP customization. So I say in the old days, not that old, in the old days for VMware, in fact, not even the old days, in the old days for SRM, which was just 18 months ago, so really not that old at all, but the rate we're moving, it is pretty old. You would have to do this through in the first version of SRM, you had to go and create customization scripts in vCenter like you do when you're running sysprep. And in fact, what we were doing is using sysprep's ability to change an IP address as part of the recovery plan. So you could go into the GUI, you could create a new customization script specification, and for SRM, and you could just change the IP address, the default gateway, and the DNS address. Now, that was fine when you were protecting 5 VMs. As soon as you multiply that by 100, it's pretty annoying to have to go through a wizard 100 times. Take it up to 1,000, and it gets really, really annoying. Not just annoying, but it's very time-consuming. It's probably somebody who's capable of far better than clicking through a wizard. So we introduced before SRM4, we introduced the idea of bulk IP customization. So this gives us the ability to create a CSV file, which we can then identify all of the virtual machines in the environment that you're going to fail over. We can then attach new IP addresses to every adapter that those virtual machines have. So yes, it can address more than one adapter. We can change the default gateway, we can change the DNS server, because probably, if you're using SRM, the environment you're failing over to is not going to have the same IP addressing scheme, unless you're lucky enough to have fiber between the two, stretched VLANs, and very relatively closely located sites. So this, hugely helps, and it means you don't have to write a whole bunch of scripts to change IP addresses, which can get quite complicated.
Anyone seen that challenge? Re-IPing, to your infrastructure? Okay. Just checking.
Unfortunately, that was, in case anybody didn't gather it.
Who's lucky enough to have the same IP scheme?
Well, then, is that for an SDR?
That's the ideal.
Right.
Although SRM can, through this process, automate changing IP addresses to all gateways and masks, we do use syscrep to make all that happen. That extends the recovery of each virtual machine by 2 to 4 minutes as they go through the syscrep and change things. So keep that in mind when you're establishing your recovery time objective. A little bit of work with your network team might actually make that recovery process much faster. We're trying to get that.
Question?
Any concerns using DHCP reservations instead of possibly destroying
I didn't hear the whole thing.
Talk about using DHCP reservations, static DHCP, so that when the machines come up in another location, that are the DHCP server there ready to give them the correct IP addresses, is actually one of the other recommended ways to.
That's what we're doing. I just want to make sure that we're not running into a
So the only possibility,
It's a time.
when a virtual machine moves from one Linux host to another, one environment to the other, we run that hash algorithm occasionally and change the MAC address. So it is possible, although it doesn't happen every time. When you move a virtual machine from one place to another, you do this in its config file. There have been cases when we alter the MAC address. We do that so we can get around the MAC address.
And I would say just based upon how often you do your testing, if you're doing your testing frequently enough, maybe just pull your reservations down,
Other question here.
your time.
So what about changing server names from one site to the other?
Changing server names. Well, we don't have a facility within the bulk IP customization, but through the scripts, the callouts, there's possibility through the VIX API or PowerShell, to communicate to the VM, and then do a name change inside the VM from the OS perspective.
Yeah, by design, we're bringing up the same virtual machine somewhere else. We didn't design in native ability to just change the VM's name. Our thinking in the back end is you're bringing up the same machine.
Exactly.
We do have customers that want to, based on the location, want to rename the virtual machine and move it somewhere else. And again, that's through some kind of script.
Right. Yes, sir.
Can you remove network adapters?
Can remove network adapters.
For example, our primary site is a multi-arm VMC, where the recovery site is a single arm.
Similar question yesterday, and that's still going to be an extension of I need to communicate to the OS to do that, right? So that would be a script that you could execute, per VM as it powers on. Do a VIX or a PowerShell script.
I think the key there is again, SRM is designed to try to automate workflow. There's a lot of advancement. Yesterday we were talking about I want to add new ones and rescan storage and do all kinds of fancy stuff. So there's no GUI tab in SRM to do all this custom stuff. But the ability to call out a script anywhere in the infrastructure and the robust API that we have virtual infrastructure and VIX API. So you could easily have it in the pre-power on call out the virtual infrastructure API and remove an adapter, or add an adapter, or add more memory, or there's all kinds of fancy things you can do. It's not built into SRM, it's built into the ability to call external servers.
Okay, so going back to the workflow of the lab, I've prepared here the line which we use to use our DR IP customizer command line application, which will, and if we use the generate switch at the end, will actually create the CSV file, and it will drag a list of all protected VMs in the primary site, so that we've pre-populated that, and then we can just go in and change the IP addresses. So if we run that, it'll ask us to check whether we've got permission. It'll ask us, do we trust the server a couple of times, ask us to log in, and that will then basically create a CSV file a little bit like what you see on the left. Mm-hmm. So we've got a list of VMs down the side, on the left-hand side. We've then, in the next column, we've got the adapter ID, so we can have multiple adapters in each VM. And then along from that, we've got the IP addresses we're changing. And that can be as I say, the main IP address, default gateway, DNS server, and so on. And we can do that to all machines. So effectively, that's much, much quicker, and that will then go and automatically, by running the same command line again with create at the end, after we've made the edits to the CSV file, we will then automatically pre-populate all those customization scripts in VC that we would have had to have gone through the wizard before. So hopefully save you lots of time. One thing to mention here is an awful lot of people make mistakes here by putting things in this CSV file that shouldn't be there. Sometimes it can be a space, which you can't even see, but the CSV file will notice it. If it's in the wrong place, you'll get some strange behavior, or it won't be accepted at all, or you might not get the right IP addresses. So one thing to be very careful of is just edit it carefully. Just put the IP addresses you want. Don't try and play around with it too much. And if you get any problems, recreate it and start again, rather than trying to find the space or the character that you put in there by mistake. Any questions on this? Yes.
We haven't implemented 4.1.
Yeah.
The way we do this is we export the sysprep file to an XML, use that as a template.
Yep.
And just modify that template and import for each machine.
Yep.
Can you do that and import out one?
Yeah, I believe so. No reason why you can't.
Yeah, you can still do this. All we're doing is automatically creating the guest customization. So if you have a different way to create the guest customization, more efficient, you just tag it in SRM as you obviously, some of the futures here are completely rewrite GUI interface and all of them. Our goal is to make this more efficient. If you jump into one of the future sessions, site recovery manager, there's a sort of things to talk about. For instance, we use sysprep now, which takes 2 to 4 minutes, but through our VIX API, we can do this in 3 seconds. We can change IP addresses and NetMask gateways. So one of our goals is to actually change the way we do this, make it far more efficient, far faster, and far more compatible in the Linux world. 5 or 6, 18 different Linux distributions. It would be nice to have a common standard way to all of them. It's more effective.
So that kind of concludes. I'm not going to go through the whole process. It'll create the scripts. We can then add them in. You guys can go and try it downstairs. But something to mention here, it's all very well being able to, just something you to consider. I'm not going to tell you how to do this, or you can ask us our opinion on this. But when you're going to change the IP address, that's all very well, very helpful, something you're probably going to need to do if you're going to move a machine into a different subnet. But how are the users going to get to that? How are people going to talk to the application? So the chances are you're going to need to do some kind of DNS update. So there's a whole section in the presentation here that you'll be able to download to have a look at with some suggestions on how you might do that. There's an awful lot of advice on the web. There's about 1,000 different ways you can cut this. So, there's no one right answer. I've had a lot of people downstairs ask me, how do we do this? There isn't a right answer. It depends on whether you've got hard-coded IP addresses in applications, how well written they are, whether you've got load balancers, whether you can automatically redirect traffic, whether you can have dynamic DNS updates, or whether you're going to have to do some manual scripting. But it is a problem, and it does need to be considered, because if you move an application, change its IP address, well, it's no use if you can't actually connect the people who use it to So we'll just skip through that. So finally is our lab on conditional scripting. So what we're doing here really is not only giving, well, we're going to show you two things. One is that we can write a script that actually returns, that will actually go off and do something. Now again, in here we're going to show you a very, very basic script. We're actually going to check the name of the VM and then decide based on that name whether we're going to power the VM on or not. Now actually, I can't really think of a use for that, but the idea is we can go out, find a piece of information, come back, return a code to SRM, and then make a decision based on that. So we could say, you know, has another service started? Has an Oracle database started? If we get the return code 0, then the script will carry on and it will power on that virtual machine and it will carry on with whatever it's doing. So what we're going to do here, as opposed to the previous script, is add a script a little like this, which again is just going to write to a log file, and it's also going to make a decision based on whether the machine's got the name Win2K server. So what I'm going to do in the demo is, in the lab, is attach that to an Ubuntu machine and a server called Win2K3. So as you can see, the script is clearly going to see the name Win2K3, power that on. It's going to take one look at the Ubuntu server and not power it on. As I said, the scripts in themselves and what we're doing here is not terribly useful, and we can't really think of a reason for it, but the concept of where you add the script is very useful. The other thing is we're going to add it in a different place. So we're actually going to add it as a pre-power on script. So rather than adding it in the main recovery plan, as you saw us in the earlier lab, we're actually going to go into one of these. We're going to edit the virtual machine itself. We're going to get to this stage, and before the power on, we're going to add the script. So if anybody's got any questions while I type this.
Sure. Probably a more useful script you might do is ping some external physical server you might need. If I have an application server getting ready to recover, pinging a database to make sure it's available, running some command, maybe pings over and over again for 2 or 3 minutes, and if I can't get access to the database, return an error code, and then SRM will power on the VM. If I do get access to the database, return a good code, SRM will power on the VM. That's more likely to run versus protecting the virtual machine.
An example someone had the other day was the ability to go and communicate to another non-virtualized infrastructure and maybe run a shell script to turn a port on to make it available to now my inside my virtualized networking, right? Something to do a call out to extend into the virtual networking to make it more efficient, or to communicate outside the drawbridge of disaster recovery.
Sorry.
No,
I've got one, have I? Well, we'll see by testing it whether we've got a typo or not. So again, I mean, a common mistake here is you get one mistake there and you're not going to execute the right thing. We had someone ask yesterday, I did a typo, but the script returned a good error code anyway, and the thing carried on. And so what he'd actually done was missed out the /C. So all it had done is gone and opened a command window and then shut it again. And it returned that as successful. So, you have to be very careful. But the great thing is, when you're running through a test, we're going to find that out. So we're going to see what happened. We're going to see, did the log file get created? Did the machine turn on? And we're going to very quickly understand whether we've got a good test or not. So that basically concludes the run-through of the lab today. We'll be around a little while afterwards to run through some questions. I'm going to run through the plan now. And hopefully we'll see if I created any other typing errors as we run through. But has anybody got any questions on the whole lab as we've got there so far?
Question.
Yeah.
How does I know this maybe this is not the scope of this lab, but I'm just thinking vFlex on its way, and how does vFlex play in SRM4?
So the answer is potentially not. I mean, the vPlex will change the way you could architect your environment. So if you're lucky enough to be able to afford a technology like that, or have the infrastructure to be able to support one, you will potentially be able to just operate HA over 2 sites. So I assume you've also got stretched layer 2 networks.
Right, we have 2 for vPlex coming in a metro setup.
Yep.
Between the 2 EWDM.
Yep.
Fire between the sites.
So having active LUNs at both sites is a privilege. SRM is effectively designed for the situations where you don't have that. There may be some useful abilities. You might still want to use it for as a workflow engine to change IP addresses and stuff. But you are in a privileged situation to have a lot more options.
And SRM is designed to recover from a known good state in case of a disaster. People are the same infrastructure most available at both locations. If I corrupt something in one location, I just replicate the corruption in another location. Right. Or you might use SRM. So from a business continuity perspective, you may not need, during normal operation of technology, like from a disaster recovery perspective, I will automatically bring an old version of something up in case I've done some kind of manual human error corruption. We still can use the technology.
I also think it's what your RT and RPO are, right? If you're looking for zeros on the RT and RPO, well, that's maybe where your availability happens, right? So you go up the scale of recovery, the scale goes, cost goes higher and higher, but you decrease those times and those. But if we look at where SRM comes into play, we're able to not only the top tier of infrastructure, but all tiers can enjoy the same investment by using SRM. That's really, I think, where the driver comes in. Why would I use vPlex versus other SRM or other opportunities is really based upon the business, what the business is trying to achieve.
Okay, so just while that's finishing up, you can see it's worked. So we've actually looked for the name Win2K Server 3, and we've seen that, so we're powering that machine on. The Ubuntu machine, on the other hand, the scripts take one look at and thought, well, that's not one for me to power on today. So you can see how the call-out scripts have worked. If we were able to go back into the infrastructure, we'd see we changed the network we've connected to. And if I had finished the DRIP customizer section, we'd have changed the IP addresses. So I do recommend, if you want to go through all those steps yourself in more detail, go downstairs, have a go. What I would also like to mention before we leave is two things. One thing that I'd like to mention, and one thing that the event organizers would like us to mention, which is please go to the vmworld.com/mobile website to provide feedback. We keep on getting told to tell you that, so please take time to do that. And secondly is our right back at the end of the presentation that you'll find online, there's a massive section of reference material. So do have a look at this. You don't need to take notes now, it'll be available on the website, but it takes you to all sorts of links, not just VMware, third-party companies. There's also some information on the process to fail back, because we find there's an awful lot of what we'd probably call FUD in the industry about the lack of SRM's ability to fail back. Absolutely not the case. It's just not quite as simple as failover. But it takes you through the process and the procedure that you go to fail back. Effectively, you're reversing the process. I think something that we'll cover in the future is a bit more, but we can share a little bit with you now. We are working on a fail back button, or what I like to call a, just reverse what I just did button. The reason we've not done that... A lot of words for that button.
A lot of words for that button.
Yeah, exactly. The reason we've not done that in the past is actually because if you think about the process of that, it's quite complicated. Firstly, every storage vendor replicates and breaks that mirror and resynchronizes in a different way. So some use a resync snapshot. Some have a sort of seesaw effect, so one LUN gets promoted while the other one's demoted. We replicate in the reverse direction. Some vendors don't have any technology like that, and you're just left with a LUN here, and you've got to copy the whole thing back again. So the actual process of reversing it is hugely different depending on what storage vendor. There are also storage vendors that already have failback scripts or plugins or snap-ins themselves that are not necessarily VMware supported. So be careful with them, but do talk to your vendor about those that are available. But I recommend having a look at all of this. So unless we've got any more questions, we'll be around for a few minutes to take any more if you want to come and ask something privately. But thanks very much for coming, and please go down and enjoy the lab.